What would have happened if JFK had lived? Well, I think we would remember him a lot less fondly. All the terrible things that happened in the 1960s, all the war, all the revolution, all the crises, we wouldn't be blaming them on LBJ or Richard Nixon, we'd be blaming them on Jack Kennedy, and here's why. So he definitely would have been re-elected. He was on course to win in 1964. But if he had been, his glory would have been really short-lived. Why? Because he would have to have dealt with civil rights. And the civil rights legislation that was so important to transforming America in the 1960s was only passed by Lyndon Baines Johnson because JFK had been shot. It was basically a tribute to the fallen president. By contrast, if JFK had run in '64 and if he had won, he would not have had the support in Congress to get all the things done that needed to be done. So we still would have had riots, we still would have had the desegregation battles, we still would have had Southern white racism, but you might not have had a president capable of actually doing anything about it. So change would have come a lot slower. Maybe most importantly, Vietnam would still have happened. JFK was the guy who said, let's put more advisors into Vietnam. He was the guy who supported the coup against the person who was running Vietnam, which led to the creation of a new government. He was the guy who supported the domino theory and who said, we've got to take a stand in Southeast Asia. So Vietnam would still have happened. All those poor American kids would still have died. But instead of blaming LBJ, we'd be blaming Jack Kennedy. And now looking back on it, he would have looked a lot less intelligent and a lot less like the peacemaker that we remember him as today. Also, all that baggage of his affairs would undoubtedly have come to light. In the late 1960s, the American press was changing. It was much more willing to expose the terrible things that politicians were up to. A good example of that was Ted Kennedy at Chappaquiddick. The press didn't stay quiet about that. And you can bet your bottom dollar that the press towards the end of the 60s, just as Kennedy's administration was winding down, would definitely have started talking about his women. And one of those, of course, was Marilyn Monroe. What if the world knew then what it knows now? Well, again, JFK would be considerably less popular, if only because in the 1960s people were still a lot more moral and a lot less willing to accept someone cheating on their wife. So JFK and all of his scandals would seem less like someone who was, really manly. They would seem more like someone who was frankly seedy. How would it all have ended? Well, it would have ended the same way that poor old Lyndon Baines Johnson's presidency ended in 1968. In disgrace. The same would have happened to Jack Kennedy. He'd have had the affairs, Vietnam, all the riots, and Jack Kennedy would have to have slunk away from the White House in '68 and retired, just like LBJ did, into obscurity. If you want an idea about what Jack would have looked like, look at Ted Kennedy, a man who pretty much ended his career in the 1970s looking fat, bloated, unlovable, and really unpopular with most of the country. That's how Jack would have ended up too. So the assassination was a tragic, terrible event in American history. But in the long run, it transformed Jack Kennedy's reputation and the way that we think about him. It made him more than just a president, it made him a martyr. And that means that nowadays we don't remember him for all the many flaws that he had. Instead, we remember him as someone who died serving his country.